More breaking news now. Stunning allegations from a whistleblower at the Department of Homeland Security.
A whistleblower complaint involving President Trump.
What are we doing violating the Constitution? I knew that if I remained silent, that I would be complicit in a crime.
The New York Times has started publication of a series of reports based on a top-secret Pentagon study of the Vietnam War.
We've got to keep our eye on the main ball. The main ball's Ellsberg. We got to get this son of a bitch.
Daniel Ellsberg went from a cold warrior and a secret keeper to a peace activist and the most iconic whistleblower in U.S. history. He's the author of Secrets, a memoir of Vietnam and the Pentagon Papers, and The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. Henry Kissinger once called Ellsberg the most dangerous man in America. Today, we call him our inaugural guest on the Primary Sources podcast. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Chip. Glad to talk to you.
So in a moment, I really want to do a deep dive into what was in the Pentagon Papers and what you hoped to accomplish by releasing them, as well as sort of the plight of whistleblowers today and your continued quest to reveal the truth, this time about nuclear war. But when I was preparing for this interview and going back over your memoirs, as well as the documentary film they made about you, The Most Dangerous Man in America, I was really struck by, and I obviously knew this, but it really struck me how before you became a whistleblower, you were very much an insider in the national security state. You recount in your memoirs different conversations you have with Robert McNamara, Robert F. Kennedy, Henry Kissinger, Herbert Humphrey. Some people might not recognize those names now, but they were pretty important people in the 60s. Could you explain to the listeners what your career trajectory looked like before you became America's most well-known whistleblower?
Having worked at the RAND Corporation, which did contract research on a nonprofit basis for the U.S. Air Force to begin with, and then for the Department of Defense, I got into subjects that were highly classified on the command and control of nuclear weapons. And that was a period when we were under a group delusion, fairly widely held by insiders, that the Soviets were on a crash program like the Manhattan Project, but on a very fast basis, to try to have the ability to disarm the United States and destroy it, essentially, so that it wouldn't be an obstacle in what we supposed to be the Soviet drive for world dominion. And we thought what we were trying to do was to deter by being able to retaliate to a surprise attack by the Soviets, and it seemed to be of extreme urgency. And I learned enough about our capabilities for retaliating under attack, which is a very challenging problem. Getting the communications in time, having a presidential decision, all very closely held, supposedly to keep the Soviets from knowing how to disarm us, that I was clearly possessing some very, quote, sensitive secrets. And that is a key to getting more when people recognize that you've been trusted and made the effort to learn these little known facts about how we operate. They trust you to keep their secrets, essentially. And I learned a lot as I went along. The Pentagon Papers were 7,000 pages, top secret, sensitive, every page, on the decision-making by the U.S. in Vietnam from 1945 to 1968. The study ended in 68 in the mistaken belief that with President Johnson having decided not to campaign against Senator Robert F. Kennedy, the brother of Jack Kennedy, appeared to drop out of the race in 1968 and to enter into negotiations with the North Vietnamese. So people thought the war is essentially over or ending. Actually, it had 7 years to go. We elected a president, Richard Nixon, who promised to end the war honorably. And he had actually a strategy for doing that, a secret strategy in mind, and I think he intended to carry that out. Obviously, he didn't succeed because the war was still going as he entered his second term in 1973. And again, people thought the war was over then when he took U.S. ground troops out. And they didn't realize that his strategy and his sense of what was required for honor of the United States was to keep President Tew, a general whom we supported in what was basically a dictatorship with trappings of democracy then. He intended to keep him in there until the end of his second term, which would be 77 or so. And to do that without U.S. troops, he intended to rely on U.S. air power, which he intended to continue as soon as the U.S. troops were out. The U.S. air power was scheduled to come in. Now, why that didn't happen had to do with my releasing the Pentagon Papers, but we'll come back to that. What the papers showed me when I, having been a researcher on them and was given access to the whole 47 volumes of this study, was that from beginning to end, there was an amazing continuity of policy, and that one president after another, having seen that it was extremely unpromising to try really to win, that it was almost impossible to destroy the nationalistic forces, the guerrilla forces led by communists in Vietnam, settled for a stalemate, which they saw as almost necessarily escalating, which it did, from advice first and help to the French, then to advisors to a new regime that we more or less settled in South Vietnam, to American troops bombing and whatnot. In all these cases, the Joint Chiefs said there was a way to win. That's always misrepresented when people talk about the Pentagon Papers, that they showed there was no way to win. There was no way to win, but that's not what the papers showed, because the Joint Chiefs of Staff continuously said, we can win if only you give us the troops we want, which was between 500,000 and 1 million troops, 500,000, which we did get in 1968. But they had always said there was a strong possibility that we would need as much as 1 million or more, and we weren't winning with the 500,000 in 68. They also said we should bomb at least up to the borders of China, targets more like they wanted it all simultaneously, but with the real realization that that might bring in the Chinese communists into Vietnam, and we would be fighting China with nuclear weapons, they assumed. So their idea was, if you let us do all of this, go into essentially a nuclear war with China, we can win. Well, President Johnson didn't believe that, and I think he was right not to believe that. But he wasn't prepared to be accused of having not only refused this advice, but lost a war, getting out, ending the war, negotiating on terms that the North Vietnamese might accept. So he consciously kept the war going and escalating to the number of troops and the bombing, though he did work with McNamara to keep the bombing less than the Joint Chiefs wanted, because it might be less than the Chinese, would cause the Chinese to come in. So he was consciously pursuing really a stalemate, a no-win war at very great cost in Vietnamese lives, millions dead ultimately, and American lives, 58,000 eventually dead. But he wasn't presenting it, needless to say, to the American people like that. On the contrary, he implied that progress was being made, which was not true, and that the end was in sight, as Westmoreland put it, the general. There's light at the end of the tunnel. Well, some people used to say that's the lights of an oncoming train. It was not. It was not a light of freedom for anybody, or the end of the war. And so you had here the evidence of lying by 4 presidents in a row, and I knew that the 5th in a row, Nixon, was making the same lies essentially about what the cost was, every aspect of the war, what the prospects were, the prospects of winning, the cost, the human costs, everything, what they expected, and what was really happening. But even more important was the question of what the lies were about. They were keeping us in a war we had really, I found, no right to be in. And that came through to me from the Pentagon Papers, and no prospects of winning. But above all, we didn't have a right to win, basically. We were following in the footsteps, this history showed, consciously, of a French effort to reconquer a former colony that had declared independence in 1945. And we were paying by 49, 80% of the costs of that French effort, largely, and continued to till they got out in 54. But we continued to do that for a number of geopolitical reasons. We wanted to get French agreement to rearming Germany. And that, again, largely for economic international reasons, for our role in Europe, and to prevent social democratic or communist or socialist governments that would not be optimal for our corporate interests, basically. So we wanted the French to agree to that, to rearming Germany, as I say, as an engine of European reconstruction after the World War, or to get dollars over to Europe after World War II. And also, it increasingly, to avoid the accusation of losing another country to communism, because communists were leading the nationalistic movement against the French and then against us. And that's basically what we were facing. But the Republicans had come to office in 52, charging that the Democrats had, quote, lost China to communism. And so neither the Democrats nor the Republicans wanted to face that charge about Indochina. They preferred a prolonged, hopeless, escalating stalemate, which involved the deaths of millions of people, and as I say, 58,000 Americans eventually. So I wanted people to understand with the Pentagon Papers that this policy was so continuous and worked the same way on each of these presidents, some Republican, some Democrat, that they could imagine and believe the truth, which was that Richard Nixon, was doing much the same, that he intended to keep General Tew, our puppet basically, our proxy, in power through his second term, even though he was planning to remove most of the troops, which American domestic politics demanded. And that looked like squaring the circle, or an impossible task, except his way of doing it was to threaten nuclear war, that if they didn't give in to our demands and take northern troops out of the southern part of Vietnam, we would hit them with nuclear weapons. And I think that was a real plan, not just a bluff. That was thwarted this is after the Pentagon Papers came out, but it was thwarted, well, no, strictly speaking, it's when I was copying them. 2 million people took time off on a weekday to demonstrate and make speeches about the war and on the demand that we get out on October 15th, 1969, which was exactly when Nixon was making these secret threats. And that was not a time for him to carry out those threats. So those people marching actually, I believe, prevented nuclear war.
And was that the War Moratorium Protest? Or was that a different?
They called it the moratorium. It was essentially a general strike because it was a weekday, people leaving work and college to go out. But the people funding it and organizing it felt the general strike sounded too radical, provocative, so they called it the moratorium, end of business as usual, businesses closed for a day. And the sight of the experience of having that many people protesting the war convinced Nixon he couldn't carry out his threats at that time. But he continued to make the threats at various times thereafter. So it remained a real danger. But that did show a way that popular action could actually have much greater effect than anyone foresaw or even understood at the time.
Yeah, I mean, in preparing for this interview, I was listening to some of Nixon's conversations that he foolishly taped with Henry Kissinger, where he's berating Kissinger for not being open to the idea of a nuclear bomb, saying, "Oh, a nuclear bomb, that bothers you, Henry? I need you to think big," like real chilling
Yes.
quotes. And then he tells him, Henry, the problem is you care too much about the civilians. I don't. Just chilling stuff to listen to. One of the things you sort of alluded to that I want to draw out more is you had worked on drafting the Pentagon Papers, and you'd been involved in some of these decisions along the way under the Johnson administration, but it isn't until the late 60s when you're starting to have profound doubts about the war that you go back and read the Pentagon Papers from the beginning. What was that experience like for you reading that history? And did it in any way influence what you thought you could accomplish by releasing those papers?
It wasn't so much what I thought I could accomplish as what I thought I had to try, and what I had to be willing to risk. Nearly every American who went to Vietnam, and there were 3 million of those in the service of the government, understood by the time they were leaving, most of them after a year, in my case 2 years, that there was no prospect of progress with what we were doing. Now, some of them thought, well, if we did it bigger, if we bombed more, if we sent more troops, maybe it would be more successful. I didn't believe that because I'd been in the beginning of the escalation and I'd seen the estimates and the forecasts. And I didn't think that more of the same would do any better. And I think most Americans, many Americans, I'll just say, over there came to that conclusion. And I came back then thinking that we should cut losses and get out. But I still accepted the idea that I had from the beginning, that whether this was unpromising or not, it was a just war, that we were opposing Stalinist leaders, which was true, essentially. The regime in North Vietnam was very close to a tight-run police state Stalinist regime, although it had very strong popular support, especially in the north, because these people had led the fight against the French and expelled these foreign occupiers. So they had a lot of prestige, and actually the people following them were very dedicated because they were very uncorrupt in their pursuit of getting rid of foreign domination, very efficient, very dedicated. And so as a friend of mine at Rand who studied a lot of prisoner interrogations from there, he said, this may be the most popular regime on earth. You can't get these people to criticize. You know, they're in our hands. Prisoners tend to say what their captors want them to say. And in this case, they wouldn't. They just wouldn't criticize the regime. That was in great contrast to the people we paid, we financed and clothed and whatnot in our side. Working for foreigners doesn't induce the same kind of patriotism and dedication that working to expel foreigners does. And that was something that the Pentagon Papers show, we were the leaders here in America, very slow to recognize. Westmoreland used to ask things, why do their Vietnamese, so much more courageous and dedicated and bold and so forth, and compared to ours, the ones we're working with? And I think I've just given the answer, which our leaders were very, very reluctant to recognize, that we were not there just as friends, as we saw ourselves, supporters, friends, buddies. We were occupiers. We were foreigners. Hard for an American to see abroad somehow that he's there as a foreigner, and if he's not just a tourist, but he's there, killing people, there is a very strong resistance to it. That's why, for instance, I looked at Afghanistan, knowing very little about the people there, and saw Vietnamistan, because when you don't have to know much about the history to know that these are people, a tribal culture largely in Afghanistan, unlike Vietnam, without a very strong sense of national identity, except on one point. They know the difference between an Afghan and a foreigner. And they cooperate, allegedly, with different valleys and different regions, very little except on one point, expelling Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, the British occupiers, the Russian occupiers. And for Barack Obama to think of that as being a smart war to get involved in compared to Iraq, which was a dumb war, seemed astonishing. It seemed like the dumbest place in the world to get involved in as an occupier, but very hard for us to see ourselves in that role. Well, I mention that to say that that's the kind of insight that I think reading the Pentagon Papers could have communicated, and I doubt very much whether Obama did really know much about Vietnam, and its history. But coming back, the papers also revealed I could say extraordinary, but except it's so consistent, it's to be expected almost, a lack of concern for the lives of the foreigners we were opposing or supporting. the civilians, and over there, there's almost no bother even to estimate how many people would be killed by the programs we were pursuing, which actually was to be counted in hundreds of thousands and up to millions, perhaps 3 to 4 million people. Very little concern about that in our leaders. And again, that shows itself in later history. But you ask about what particularly struck me was reading the earliest volumes, which I put to
The Truman
last,
years.
the Truman years. I put to last reading those on the assumption they were the least relevant. It was sport of, we weren't there with American troops at that point, and discovered that, as I think I described it earlier, that what we were involved in was essentially a colonial struggle by the French, which we were fully participating in. In fact, the Vietnamese, we saw that as the French War. The Vietnamese saw it as the French-American War. They understood that the Americans were financing this whole project by the French after a few years, and that they saw this as a continuous American war from 1945 to 75, when it finally did end. And that didn't have any legitimacy in the eyes of an American like myself, a patriotic American boy who grew up in the Second World War, where we were fighting an evil regime. Well, the adversaries of nearly everyone in a war are seen as evil. That was pretty apt in the case of Hitler and the Japanese militarists. And we were on the side. I've never become a total pacifist, because it does seem to me that armed resistance and lethal resistance to German bombers over London or to German troops invading Russia was not just acceptable or it was the right thing to be doing. And so total pacifism runs up against that as far as I'm concerned, and I don't. But this was a beginning for me, a beginning to look critically at all our various involvements, including Vietnam, starting with the thought that we had no legitimate right to be doing this in Vietnam. We had no right to be killing any Vietnamese, whoever led them. And that meant that since it was an American war, there was not just a just war in the beginning, that everyone who died in that war was a victim of American policy, and it was an unjustified homicide. And to me, that meant murder. And murder was something that just a program of murder. And murder was not something you could be part of. And moreover, you couldn't be silent about it. It was your duty, I think, to expose it. I think, Chris, you raised the question of, you mentioned that I saw it at one point as a mistake and then as a crime.
In your book, we were talking a little bit before we started recording the interview, just to let the listeners know what we're referencing. But in your book, I think on the first page, you say, your evolution of thinking through the Vietnam War went through 3 stages. You first viewed it as a mistake, and then I don't recall if you used the term quagmire or stalemate, but that's your second phase of development. And your final stage of development was you viewed it as a crime. And each of those 3 things you write in your book determined how you reacted in a given situation. And I'm just curious to you, because I have a sense of what I think the answer is, but since you wrote it, I want to know what you think. What is the difference in your mind between a crime and a mistake, and what moral obligation do you have in responding to a crime in a particular way you might not have in responding to a mistake?
I've just described, of course, murder is seen generally
crime.
as a crime. It's defined as a crime. Not all killing in war is a crime, but a lot of it is. And that's true even in a just cause, as in World War II. I would say that our firebombing of cities in Japan was criminal, and that's before the atomic bombs. We burned to death 100,000 people, largely women and children, because the men were away at war, in Tokyo with firebombs, burning them alive. I think that was clearly a criminal act by all precedents and by any standard of values worthy of respect, I think. And yet, caused very little exposure resistance. Few Americans even know that that occurred. It was the largest act of terrorism in human history. 100,000 people, I repeat, in one night burned alive, and or asphyxiated in their shelters, or boiled to death in rivers that they fled to against the flames, and the rivers, the ponds were boiling, and that was deliberately achieved. Okay, well, that was even in a combat, I think, that was just. In an unjust war, where you have no business, an aggressive war, everybody you're killing. I think the militants are likewise should not be killed. They're defending themselves, and these people thought of themselves with reason as defending their country against foreign occupation. So that to me was something that, whereas if it was just a mistake, you say, well, everyone makes mistakes. This leadership may well be worthy of following and respect, and keeping in office, and doing your best to help them correct the mistake. If what they're doing is wrong, basically wrong, then persuading them of that is very unpromising from inside. You just get weeded out, or you lose your access, you get fired. It almost has to be done from outside. You have to hold them accountable and try to present in democratic societies like ours, a counterforce that will force them out of office and force a change in this policy. And actually the war was ended by our constitutional system acting in an almost, I could say, unprecedented way of forcing Richard Nixon out of office in a way that no one foresaw by facing him with impeachment. Something that's not possible in the monarchy that we revolted against in the War of Independence. You couldn't impeach the king, but a big difference between a president and a king is that the president can be impeached as well as voted out of office, and obviously has not been done. In that case, he was facing certain impeachment and he resigned, which made the war endable. But we haven't seen impeachment being very effective in more recent times.
No, we have not.
Yeah, but it's there, at least in principle. And so, in short, then I was confronted with the example of people who saw the war as I did, as wrong to participate in, and were, having been ordered to join it, refusing that and going to prison instead of the draft. And instead of going to Canada or Sweden, which was also very legitimate in my eyes, rather than going to Vietnam, but these people wanted the strongest possible statement that the war was something you should not participate in. Not just that they didn't, but you shouldn't. And which pleading, let's say, a bone spur like Trump to get out of the war, Donald Trump, a fictitious bone spur, doesn't exactly convey the message that he says he felt, that the war, well, I think he said the war was foolish. He didn't, it wasn't something he wanted to be part of. Nevertheless, these people were saying, no, this is wrong, and I won't go, even at great cost to myself. That conveys the sense of conscience here that bone spurs don't, for example.
So Dan, when you gave the Pentagon Papers to the public, first to Congress, then to the media, did you view your act of truth-telling then as an act of resistance to an unjust and illegal war?
Yes, you're quoting, I think, sort of the theme of Noam Chomsky's chapter of responsibility, perhaps, of intellectual.
I wasn't even thinking that when I wrote the question, but I'm familiar with his New York Review of Book Essays, Responsibility of Intellectuals. Yeah, no, but it must have been subconscious. It must have been.
Well, no, wait. To go a little further. First of all, your quoting of me, the crime, the stalemate,
yes,
and so forth, I think is not from secrets, if I'm not mistaken, but from papers on the war. Am I mistaken on that? The earlier
I didn't read papers on the war.
Oh, you really? Well, then.
I didn't do.
I was going to give you credit for that.
I didn't do all the class reading, Dan. I didn't do all the class reading.
That's a good one, though.
I will read it after this interview. I will go straight to my library, which has all of your books, actually.
Okay. Well, now, I actually thought I was paraphrasing Noam Chomsky when I put the last chapter of that book Papers on the War, with the title, The Responsibility of Officials in a Criminal War, not just intellectuals. It's funny, I've always, my friend Noam Chomsky, who I've learned.
You were arrested with him.
As much for, arrested, but.
And Howard Zinn.
Yes, now I've learned very much from both of them. On this one point of the responsibility of intellectuals, the title implies, or the theme implies, as he says, where the intellectuals have a particular responsibility, he says, to tell the truth and expose lies. But I don't think intellectuals as a whole actually feel that responsibility, and no one holds them to account very much. And no one has done more than Noam himself to say that what intellectuals actually do, most of them, is to serve power, to serve the interests of empire, to justify it, rationalize it, explain it, so support it. That's what intellectuals actually do, and they help each other doing it. So how can you say they have some different responsibility? But I was raising the point of, what about responsibility of officials who supposedly serve a national interest in some way, when they're doing something that is not only involves their country in unjust and murderous criminal behavior, and at the same time lying totally about what they are doing to Congress and to the public, and making it impossible to hold them accountable democratically or electorally. And I compared in that, if you'd be interested in that essay.
I will read it. I promise you I will read it.
I raised the issue of Ellsberg Speer, was Hitler's number 3 man, basically, after Goering, who at one point was asked, how could you, as an intellectual, which he was, serve a rogue criminal regime like Hitler's? And he said, there is no correlation between intelligence and decency. And
wow.
Now that sounds strong, because we like to think that high IQ surely goes along with good values of some sort. But the value of loyalty to a boss or a regime can outweigh almost everything else. It keeps you in your job, keeps you in your career, it makes you respectable among your peers generally. And it was loyalty, I think, that kept Robert McNamara, who's a character very like Speer, and in his case, I think more skeptical of what we were doing in Vietnam than even Speer was about the Nazi policy. And yet he had this sense of loyalty, he said, to his boss, Lyndon Johnson, that outweighed everything else. He even at one point said in an interview, there is this concept floating around that there's some higher loyalty to something other than the president. And he says, I think that's heretical. Now, that's an amazing notion, except I think rather widely held among officials. It is basically like the Führer leader principle in Nazi Germany, where the oath was to the Führer, to the leader. And people working for the president then in Vietnam and now, I think, to a very large extent, can't even imagine a loyalty that goes beyond or higher than the president that they work for, or their party, or their agency. And even though the oath they actually take, every one of them on office, man or woman, in the armed services, in Congress, and in the bureaucracy, they all take the same oath, which is not to the president, and it's not to secrecy. It is to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Well, lying to the Congress or public about the prospects of a war that you're getting into is not supporting the Constitution. And yet I think very few of them feel that actual conflict. I was very struck when both Chelsea Manning and particularly Ed Snowden mentioned that they'd taken an oath, because in my experience, and I speak for myself here too, as a government employee, you just don't think of that oath as having any particular content that, other than supporting the president. What could be? And yet when the president is acting unconstitutionally, which is not uncommon, look at the one we just had, Trump.
Yes.
But not only him, when Barack Obama got us into war in Libya. And his counsel, Harold Cole, testified, well, we didn't have to call on Congress to consent to this agreement because it's not a real war. We weren't dying. Our involvement was just air, drones, pilots, and whatnot. They were in no danger from anti-aircraft. So it's not an armed conflict. It's just a presidential something that he can do at his own will. Obama was not held accountable for that. And George W. Bush was not held accountable for this clear-cut aggression against Iraq. And now we have this more than 20-year war in Afghanistan, which may be ending in terms of ground troops, which is, I believe, a good thing at last to end. But we're being told, by the way, that as in Nixon's days, the air war is going to continue. We're going to continue to exert our right to go into the airspace over Afghanistan and use air power and drones from bases outside Afghanistan. So people are still being killed and in Afghanistan. And studies have shown that the drones kill about 17 people for every targeted person that they go after. The people who are with them or the wrong targets, the wrong buildings. So that the so-called collateral damage, the bystanders that get killed, greatly outweigh. Now, the man who exposed that, Daniel Hale, is in jail right now for exposing the fact, the information. He is a whistleblower. And I think the information he put out was very much needed by the public to hear, though, as is very often the case, you don't see any discernible response to it yet. It's there for the public to act on, but they haven't done so.
Well, there's so many threads I could follow up on with what you just said, but I want to end with the last one. You mentioned you haven't seen a response to what Daniel Hale released. Daniel Hale is the Air Force veteran who was in the killer capture chain who released the drone papers. Defending Rights and Dissent has supported him and called for Biden to pardon him. We've opposed his prosecution. But I was sort of wondering, did your release of the Pentagon Papers have the reaction you were hoping for?
It did affect people's attitude toward the war, but the attitude was already by that time, by 71, the majority were very much against the war, in fact regarded it as immoral, as I had come to do. So I saw it as immoral from the beginning, having read the Pentagon Papers, but I think most people saw reasonably the continuation of it as being immoral, being hopeless to no end, even if the origins had been just. I think that's a much more common attitude among people who hadn't read the papers. And I don't know how many did read the earliest papers, as I did, that make that point. So it had an effect on public opinion and discussion, but Nixon wasn't paying any attention to that. He'd been pursuing choices in the war that the public didn't want and didn't know he was pursuing, but regardless of public opinion. So the war really went on. And a year after the Pentagon Papers came out, or a little less than a year, there was an offensive, a North Vietnamese offensive, that led to the heaviest bombing of the war. And at the end of that year, it was several weeks, 2 weeks of the heaviest bombing for 2 weeks in human history. More tonnage of bombs, in other words, that were dropped on Tokyo or the other cities for 2 weeks. So that it appeared, as far as I could see, that the Pentagon Papers had no effect where I wanted it, which was on the actual progress of the war, the continuation of the war. And that was very disheartening. It turned out that there had been an effect, namely telling these truths had very reasonably worried Nixon that I might have documents on the lies he was telling and the threats he was making. The Pentagon Papers ended in '68. So unfortunately, it turned out people were still willing to trust Nixon, the current president, on what he said he was doing, even though in reality, he was doing what all his predecessors had done, lie into continuing the war. So it didn't convince them that if 4 presidents in a row lie in this same way, that maybe the 5th is doing it anyway. The tendency to believe a president is very strong without documents, and I didn't have it. But to keep me from revealing documents that he reasonably feared I might have about his nuclear threats and others, he had taken crimes against me to shut me up, to try to go into my former doctor's office to get information to blackmail me with into silence. We'll release this damning stuff that you don't want out somehow. He didn't find that. Then he took measures actually to incapacitate me physically at a moment when he had reason to believe I would be putting out more stuff in 1972, and during the offensive. These crimes were unexpectedly revealed by John Dean telling the truth to prosecutors, by Alex Butterfield showing that there were tapes existing that would demonstrate what Dean was saying, and then by special prosecutors refusing, to give up their search for the tapes. I could name a number of things. So there were maybe 40 or 50 other people who did things that were individually necessary and no one sufficient to actually to drive Nixon from office, face him with impeachment. And that did, in fact, help end the war. And that meant that our act of my wife and I and others who helped of putting out the Pentagon Papers had been one link in this chain of events that made a war endable in a way that really no other war I can think of has actually been ended by the legislature cutting off the money for it and facing the president, the leader, with impeachment. For example, the second time I know of the Congress doing that was over Yemen just last year, when they cut off the money for Yemen. And the president vetoed that. Trump vetoed that and couldn't override the veto. So it didn't have that effect. I think, actually, wait, there's another case.
Yugoslavia?
Well, no. I'm sure what you're thinking of in Yugoslavia. No, what I'm thinking of is Nicaragua, where actually Congress did cut off the money for covert action in Nicaragua to overthrow the regime in Nicaragua under Reagan. And Reagan got the money unconstitutionally. You're not supposed to spend money that is not appropriated by Congress. He got it from, I think, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia and, various other angles, even illegal or arms sales to Iran, various things. He got the money not from Congress to continue the action. So it didn't actually have the effect. But in the case of Vietnam, what it shows is it can have an effect. And really the experience of whistleblowers, I think in general, national security whistleblowers, is not promising in terms of the likelihood of a major effect. You'd have to say it's not, first, it's certainly not guaranteed. It's not even very likely, but it's possible. And we're talking about situations here where many, many lives may be at stake. Or as in Ed Snowden's case, the Constitution is being totally flouted, Fourth Amendment and domestic laws against surveillance. In other cases, torture is happening. There are situations where people absolutely should consider paying a very high personal cost in order to get the truth out, because a war's worth of lives may be saved. And I would even have to say, if it's just a matter of exposing a particular lie, after all, the government lies every day, and if you can't stand being in an institution that lies, you can't really be in the executive branch very long. And to give up your career, go to prison, whatever, for one random lie, let's say, or one piece of cost overrun or waste or embezzlement or something like that. Hard for me to imagine that the costs are worth it. But there are many situations where the costs are worth it. And unfortunately, you rarely see people rising to that challenge. You don't find the moral courage of facing ostracism and possible even imprisonment. And I wish there were many more than there are.
I will note that you mentioned the tonnage of bombs dropped on Vietnam, and I know that when you were on trial, you would always, in all of your media press conferences, mention the tonnage of bombs dropped that week, and you were always very angry. The media would not reprint that. So I just wanted to acknowledge that I heard you mention the tonnage, and I find that very fascinating. You have sort of an unenviable distinction in that you were the first whistleblower indicted under the Espionage Act. It had previously been used against socialist and war opponents, including Eugene Debs, who very famously said, if war be right, let it be declared by the people, which I always find very interesting since, there's sort of a thread between that quote and sort of using the Espionage Act to silence people who want the American people to be able to make democratic decisions about their foreign policy, about the national security state. Since we've seen a number of other whistleblowers indicted: Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, Thomas Drake, Daniel Hale, who's in jail right now when we're discussing this, and now Julian Assange, a journalist. The U.S. is trying to extradite him. You've urged Congress to reform the Espionage Act and Rittenhouse Snowden could not get a fair trial. Could you explain why the Espionage Act needs to be fixed and why it's so urgent that Congress takes action?
Well, the act that they use, the 1917 Act, and as amended in 1950, actually, during the McCarthy years, was initially intended against spies, people who give information secretly to a foreign power, especially in wartime, to advantage that foreign power. And it was written rather broadly because it's hard for an actual spy to justify what they're doing in the country where they're doing the spying. Of course, our spies we see as heroes in other countries, but they are breaking the laws of these other countries, and they wouldn't get a lot of advantage if they were being tried in those other countries for explaining they were doing it for the good of the U.S. Now, I mention that to say the act was written as a strict liability act where the intention is not a factor, where you're not allowed to argue. It's judged to be irrelevant why you did what you did. You're not even allowed to answer the question in front of the jury. Why did you, as I was asked, why did you copy the Pentagon Papers? Couldn't even tell the jury that. Well, that's hardly a fair trial because the whole point of the action and what does or does not justify it is what you hope to achieve in the way of informing the public and what is wrong with the current policy and so forth. Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, any of these others would not be allowed even to let the jury know with that, and that they can't have a fair trial, and the people who have been prosecuted have not had fair trials. And really the very prospect of losing the trials almost inevitably when they can't even explain what the issues were has kept most of the people accused giving plea deals, pleading guilty rather than getting a much bigger sentence if they went to trial. So that law really needs to be changed. The country needs whistleblowers because so much of our foreign policy is secret from the American people because it is unjustifiable, because it serves special interests of various kinds that the public as a whole would not support if they knew what was going on. So we need people to tell that, more of them. That doesn't mean that the mere intent is enough to excuse anything they do. You have to see what the alternatives were and what the actual impact was and so forth. But currently, none of that can even be addressed in the court. So the act could be amended. There have been proposals or resolutions, in fact there was in the last Congress, to change that to assure a public interest defense, or as Yochai Benkler of Harvard calls it, a public accountability offense. For example, by the way, what you may be exposing is clearly criminal, and yet if it's stamped secret under the current act, you're guilty of putting it out even if what you're doing is revealing a crime. And that can be changed and should be changed. The cases you give of Debs, by the way, if I may say, there's a very, very common, I think, misconception, almost general, about that act in the beginning. Debs was charged under amendments to the 1916 Act,
Sedition Act.
as was Shank and some others. They were amendments in 1918 called the Subversion Act, but they were amendments to the Espionage Act. And Debs actually was convicted for criticizing the draft, urging people not to go in the draft in World War I. And many others were convicted under that. But those amendments were repealed in, I think, 1921 or 22. So then until my case, another 50 years go by when the Espionage Act is used only against spies. But starting with me, which didn't succeed because of government criminality and my trial was ended, really there were only two prosecutions after that before President Obama. And one of those was withdrawn by Obama. But Obama brought 9 cases against whistleblowers or leakers, and Trump brought about the same number in his first term. So in short, what they're doing is using, and now Trump then did something that the Obama administration refrained from doing, and that was charging Julian Assange as a journalist, the first journalist to be charged. All the others, like me, had been sources from within the government. And of course, if you cut off the sources, you pretty well cut off, good investigative journalism. But if you go after the journalists themselves, you really, you ended it pretty much if they get convicted for putting out this information. So Trump actually did indict Julian Assange. That was a first. And then Biden has renewed that. They're trying to extradite him from England. And a judge in England had rejected the extradition, but Trump appealed that on his last day in office. And Biden people have renewed the appeal. That, again, should be changed. Certainly that appeal should be dropped. Assange should be free, out into the sunlight for the first time in how many years now? About 10 years or so.
Yeah.
He just started he was in the Ecuadorian embassy for about 7.5 years, and then he's been in Belmarsh prison in isolation. So that should end. That should go the way, let's say, of the Sedition Act in this sense, you might say. The Espionage Act should be either amended or rescinded, those provisions of it, and not used as a British type Official Secrets Act, which criminalizes any release of classified information. And since anything really embarrassing to the government in revealing deception or bad judgment or crimes or lie, is going to be classified indefinitely. And to allow that to be, for anyone to expose that, to be exposed to criminal prosecution, cuts at the possibility of democracy.
So we're coming up near the end of our time together. I could talk to you for days, but a lot of people could. So I appreciate your generosity with your time. And I have two final questions for you. After the Pentagon Papers, you continued to be an activist for peace, for justice. I know I saw you speak per Facebook, I think it was 8 years ago, at a rally for Chelsea Manning. In 2017, you wrote another memoir, this one called The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner. And this book has been back in the news recently because as in conjunction with the release of this book, you've revealed that you copied another study. In addition to the Pentagon Papers, you have released it to your website. Could you tell us what that's about and what led you to want to both release this study and publish The Doomsday Machine? What are you hoping to accomplish this time?
As I mentioned much earlier, my original work was on nuclear planning and nuclear plans and command and control, the possibility of unauthorized use of nuclear weapons, or authorized use in very reckless or false alarm situations. And so that's always been my major preoccupation. In a way, Vietnam, for 10 or 11 years, was almost a distraction, a very compelling distraction. from my work to reduce the chance of nuclear war. So as soon as that was over, I sought to get out what I knew about nuclear weapons, and was told that the public isn't interested in nuclear weapons. That was true in '75, and it's true now, essentially. Very hard to get it published, to get something published. In fact, this book, The Doomsday Machine, was rejected by 17 publishers before Bloomsbury took it, on the grounds that there was no commercial interest in it, that anything with the word nuclear in the title was doomed. And the Bloomsbury edition actually sold more than these other people expected, but not enough to have any change on anything that I can see. But so my current revelation, recent one, is something really I've tried at various other times to get out much earlier. But this time, a combination of the web, which didn't exist back in '75 or '80s, putting it out on the web was possible. And that didn't attract any attention when I did it, in fact. But Charlie Savage of the New York Times showed that for the same reason that I was concerned now, namely that there is talk of war with China over Taiwan, which was the subject of this top secret study of the 1958 Taiwan Straits crisis, where the still classified parts of the study, which I put out now, show people talking as if the dialogue were crafted by Terry Southern and Stanley Kubrick for Dr. Strangelove. It's the same kind of thing. We want to use small tactical nuclear weapons on China in order to forestall some, quote, misguided humanitarian impulse to restrict us to obsolete iron bombs and hot lead. Now, that's straight out of Dr. Strangelove, in effect. And yet this is the commander of the Pacific Air Forces, General Cooter, telling the president and the Secretary of State how, as the chief of staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, was also saying, Twining, nuclear weapons are inevitable here, we've got to be prepared. And as Twining said, yes, the Soviets may respond to an attack on their ally, China, with nuclear weapons on Taiwan, which would annihilate Taiwan, and on our bases in Guam and Okinawa, which would mean, as he well knew, a general war with the Soviet Union in which hundreds of millions would die, and in fact, though he didn't know it, billions from nuclear winter, which he didn't know about at that time. But just from the effects we did know about, they expected close to 1 billion deaths. And he said, but if you're going to defend these islands, offshore islands, some 1.2 miles from the mainland, from Chinese mainland, if you're going to defend those, you have to accept the consequences. The consequences are, a third of the population of the world being annihilated. Well, that sounds insane.
It does. It does.
It is insane, but it illustrates something I've learned long before I was 90, and that is that, as Speer put it, very intelligent people can have a crazy streak, can believe crazy ideas, and do crazy things. Really, the motives for going into Vietnam look crazy when you look at the Pentagon Papers. But in this case, it's a question of threatening and risking general nuclear war. It's threatening and risking a clearly insane action. Would, to say accept the consequences is a kind of insanity. And yet it reflected the temper of the times that haven't changed that much internally. Because I don't think, for example, we would take a high risk of general war over Quemoy and Matsu that were at issue in 1958, islands a mile or two from China. We wouldn't do that today, I think. If the Chinese take Quemoy and Matsu, which are still independent of Peking, I don't think we'd go to war. We're talking about going to war, though, over Taiwan now, which is 100 miles. Okay, so for 100 miles from China, thousands of miles from us, even though our prospects of winning a non-nuclear war are not so good because the Chinese have built up in the last 20 years. And precisely because we did humiliate them in 1996 over the same issue, they had to back off. So like Khrushchev or I should say Brezhnev, after the Cuban Missile Crisis said, well, we won't let you humiliate us again like this. And they built up. The Chinese have built up in the last 20 years. And so now, again, the prospect of war with them has the same consequences. Accept the consequences, accept that sounds insane. And yet, very intelligent people are capable and do exhibit, actually, this kind of insanity. And that's why democracy, which is no guarantee against following this kind of policy, does give us, I think, a better chance. That's why, in answer to your question, I wanted to reveal the insanity of our thinking with respect to nuclear weapons in hopes that the public, first of all, will get that picture. And I think it's very hard to read any of this new material I put out without coming to that conclusion. The next question is, what do you do about it? And unfortunately, I've learned that's not the same thing as just learning about it. People can learn about it and go along.
Well, I guess that leads into my final question for you. This is the first episode of the Primary Sources podcast. Our guest next week is James Goodale, who we've already recorded the interview with. And the last question I asked him, and I want to give you the same question, was if you could talk to Joe Biden, and I have no guarantee he's listening right now. He's probably not. But if you could talk to Joe Biden, what would you say to him?
That's really a very challenging question, because we are encouraged to believe that simply to convince the president of a better course of action gives you that change. He'll do it. He's convinced. He's the president now. What we've seen with president after president is that they have really gotten quite good advice from inside and felt they could not follow it. They didn't have the capability. Does President Biden or any other president have the ability to convert the tax money and the resources that are going into the Doomsday machine to essential civilian purposes like sustainable energy or infrastructure or health or education or anything else? Does he actually have the ability to do that? That's not easy to answer. I could tell him what is desirable. It is highly desirable that I would tell him, not build ground-based strategic deterrence, that is more ICBMs, which are actually dangerous to us in that they trigger the doomsday machine. They have to be launched on warning. They're called a strategic deterrent, ground-based strategic deterrent, GBSD. What are they deterring? Not nuclear attack, because in a nuclear attack, they would be destroyed. They're deterring things that we threaten to, where we threaten to initiate nuclear war. You can only use those things if you strike first. And most of the public don't realize that at all. So they don't have the same function or the same effect, let's say, as warheads on submarines, of which we have far too many, more than we can justify, but at least they don't have to be launched to keep them from being destroyed. They're essentially invulnerable. So I would say no ICBMs. Agree with Putin in the terms in which Reagan and Gorbachev actually discussed. For the first time, two leaders, or even one leader, took seriously the possibility of eliminating nuclear weapons. In other words, when you talk to him in a couple of weeks, he's going to talk about eliminating the doomsday machines on both sides, mutually, getting rid of the ICBMs, going off launch on warning, greatly reducing the numbers and so forth, and converting those resources to other means. Now, that means confronting Boeing, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed, with a change in their form of business or going out of business. The way we want, ultimately, by 2050 at the latest, Exxon to be out of its current business of extracting and selling fossil fuels that are dooming civilization. And these other companies now are, in the same way. The way the tobacco companies doomed people, on a lesser level, to cancer for many years, and are still doing it. Well, that last statistic shows you can have some effect. We have had some effect in this country on the tobacco companies. Their worldwide sales have been fine. Their profits are more than they used to be, as far as I know. But I think it is true that fewer people die from either first-hand or second-hand smoke, and that was a result of a combined public and governmental action, of which we need more. You take these other companies. Are we really going to keep that oil in the ground? And here's the question: can the president do it? Well, we'll see. This morning's news, as we talk, Joe Manchin is threatening to keep the filibuster. He's a Democrat, supposedly, but he's telling the president, no, you can't. You can't preserve democracy by allowing people to vote, actual low-income minorities, blacks, to vote, or make it easier for them to vote. You've got to make it harder, so we'll make it less likely that they will vote, since they might vote Democratic. Can he get that through? Can he get through his infrastructure program? So, in other words, in the case of Biden, I think he probably on the whole knows what would be good for the world. Let me take that back a little bit, because he's doing better, obviously, on domestic matters than almost anyone expected. And obviously better than his predecessor, which is a very low bar, but better than Obama, better than Clinton, actually, on the others. So that's quite good. But on foreign policy, whether he can get it or not, at least he's trying. On foreign policy, he isn't trying to be better very much. The anti-China business is pretty much what we saw started under Obama and very much under Trump, making a new Cold War. And really, I can only see the reason for calling China an enemy or an adversary here, as opposed to another great power, rival or competitor, and collaborator and partner, as justifying the defense budget. And he's showing no impulse at all to reduce that defense budget or in our foreign policy in general. So
he's also continuing on the prosecution of Assange.
Yeah, that's true.
And
he called Assange a high-tech terrorist at the time, which was crazy. But, no government likes people to air its dirty linen. And Assange did, in fact, embarrass Hillary Clinton in a number of ways by revealing, thanks to Chelsea Manning, her involvement in corrupt activities of various other countries that we were encouraging. And so understandable that she would be angry, and probably communicated that to Biden. Anyway, I would say rethink our status as an empire, our role as an empire, which has been steady there, as Danny Sherson says in a very wonderful new book that I just saw, A True History of the United States, reveals more than even I know yet at 90, much more about, again, the origins of our country, the imperial instincts of our country from very early on, not just late in the game. And that has committed us in the end to doomsday machines. From my own perspective and my own experience, I would probably, if I saw him, concentrate on saying, use your powers to the fullest that you can imagine and extend, and with advice to dismantle the doomsday machine, and to do that in company with the Russians, because it is very, and that's hard, they have their own military-industrial complex to confront just as we do, but that together you can do things that neither one could politically manage alone. And I can imagine that that might actually take hold.
Dan, I hope the president is listening. Once again, I don't think I have that much reach in the White House.
You're doing what you can. At this
But I'm doing what I can.
Thank
Thank you. I'm doing what I can. Yes. I will make sure to tag him on Twitter when we release the podcast. Dan, thank you so much for joining me. It is such an honor to see you again. I know we've done other events together. It is just always such a pleasure to talk to you.
Same here, Chip.
It is just
Same.
wonderful. And if you enjoyed our interview with Daniel Ellsberg, we'll be back with a second episode of the podcast featuring James Goodale, the New York Times General Counsel, who was behind the decision to publish the Pentagon Papers within the Times. And primary sources will continue to interview national security whistleblowers to tell their own stories and their own words about what they exposed, why they exposed it, and the challenges they face.